I am. I'm just a little
There we go.
slow. There
There.
we go.
Good. Yay. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We're going to get started here. Thank you for your patience. We're really excited for this breakout session to have Kymm Mutch with us to talk about procurement pathways. And are you ready for some new options? Uh, if you want to go to the next slide here, just a couple of housekeeping issues here is that we are going to, this session is being recorded. And we're going to use the chat on the right side of your screen to answer any questions that Kymm has, or if anybody wants to weigh in on anything. And in that chat section, you'll notice that you have the options for event and then session. When you click event, it goes out to everyone at every session. So we're going to stick with just the session here. So if you're able to put that, I do have one message in there just to welcome everybody. And then the three dots at the top right allows for any kind of screen adjustments that you want. If you want to pin a specific window or click to full screen, however you'd like to do that. Okay, so as far as disclosure goes, I've already said that we are recording this for anyone that's at a different session and wants to come back and watch this one as well. And we are excited to have Kymm with us. Kymm is a registered dietitian and a school nutrition consultant for Much Better Food, LLC. She's also a former food service director at Milwaukee Public Schools and has worked extensively with school districts on the national level to facilitate innovative procurement and financial strategies. So welcome, Kymm. We're excited to hear
Thank
what you have
you.
to
It's
say.
great to be here. I just did the lunch session on wellness, and that was awesome. And so I hope everybody was able to join that, and they're feeling relaxed and their mind is open and ready to look at some new strategies for procurement. Um, I want to just start with what an ideal procurement is. And before I even, I guess, before I start with that, I want to say that I'm not going to discuss, formal and informal procurement in terms of the details of those kinds of things or micro purchase or any of those kind of things that we think about when we're thinking about procurement training. So if you're brave enough to be here, I'm hoping that you've along the way, seen a state agency presentation, seen something at School Nutrition Association, somewhere that you've had a little bit of the USDA guidelines. I'll kind of refer back to it, but I'm coming at this more from a business and a actual procurement perspective. So basically what we're looking at is ideal procurement really focuses on 4 steps. One, we need to do research and analysis. Number 2, we have to have stakeholder discussions, and those are who's going to be actually using the product that we're looking to procure. So, obviously in food service, we're going to be looking at, our managers and purchasing food, and our students are going to be the ones who are ultimately eating it. Likewise, if you were doing something like menu software or a point of service software, you would want to talk with the people that are going to be using that software, so get their feedback and their input. So that's going to be an important part of what we talk about today. Procurement event, the actual event itself, is what do you have to do to get ready to get this procurement process done? And I'm going to talk probably a little bit more about that. That's really where I think some of the opportunity lies, is could we do that process differently? And then finally, just some brief touches on performance management. It's really about managing the contract. I think so many times we think about procurement and we think about, okay, once the bid's awarded or once we've made a selection on the vendor, we're off. And in fact, we are off. We're off and running, but it's really going to be more about managing and developing a relationship with the vendor and making sure that you're getting your needs met and you're communicating. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that. So I want to start with research and analysis. I think it's very interesting because there are some key points that I have become aware of recently. In my business, one of the things that I've recently been doing is working with some vendors and manufacturers who are bringing new items to the school food market. And in the process, I've been assisting them with their bid responses to publicly posted bids for food products. And that's part of what prompted this topic, because I'll tell you, and these are larger urban school districts, but not all of them. Some of them are cooperatives, and we'll talk about that concept as well. But the thing that really became evident to me is that there are some people who are doing just a really great job, and really it's an easy process and an easy bid to interact with. And there are others that you can tell that the bid or the RFP was just revitalized from last year. And in some cases, there's typos and errors and date errors and that kind of thing. But more critically, it's like there's old language or an old paradigm that's in that RFP. So I think one of the things that, in our strive to be efficient, we may revitalize or revive what we've used in the past, only to realize that, maybe we need to take a deeper look at that. And so that's, and having worked in a system at Milwaukee Public Schools, we often did that. We pulled out the old RFP, looked to see what it said, and if we could work with that, which is, there's absolutely nothing wrong, and it's great to do it. But I would also encourage you to look at it kind of, yes, on the detail level, but also what I would call a meta-analysis, and see, is this really what we want to ask for when we're putting together our bid, and what is it we really need? And the other thing that was really interesting as I helped out with the bid process was how many times I could see some portion of the bid language have been changed in one section, but not in another. And so that's just kind of a little thing that you might want to keep your eye on as you're doing that process. So yeah, does the RFP or a bid that you're going to use meet the needs? Has anything changed? In some cases, because of a procurement review, there are new strategies and new steps and processes that you have to do in order to be compliant with your state agency's guidance coming down from USDA. And what are other districts doing? I mean, one of the cool things about being in school food is we're not in competition with each other. So there's nothing wrong with you picking up the phone and calling your neighboring school district and talking to that food service director, or talking to other food service directors, and find out what they're doing for their procurement process. And I know it's not exactly a hot topic, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, just finding out what's going on may help you be more current and more up to date. And I think in that process, that's part of the market research that needs to be done. I think many times when people think about a food service director, they don't think about procurement, and they really don't always fully understand how much time and effort it takes, both to prepare the bid, to get the research done before you prepare the bid, then to take through the process of the bid, and you've got the board back and forth that's required so that you go at the appropriate times to get the appropriate amount. And in some states, you also, when you do a procurement, have to share your bid/RFP with a state agency. All of those steps are important. They should not be skipped, and they take additional time. So it's a layered process. I really find that benchmarking is very critical when we're looking at preparing the bid, and then also what we're going to use to evaluate the bid. So identify your benchmarks to the best of your ability. Making them as simple as possible is going to be really helpful. Obviously, with school food, and because if we're looking at a true bid, we're looking at awarding based on price. So obviously, you need to get some kind of a feel for, what is this piece of equipment going to cost? Or what did I spend last year for food? Or what did I spend last year in paper trays? Those kinds of things are very simple, and maybe things that you have right at your fingertips that you could access. Contacting your state people is going to be important. Sometimes talking to people in other states is incredibly helpful. I was, as I said before earlier, was at Milwaukee Public Schools, and so I knew what was happening in Milwaukee Public Schools. We had an overlay of the city of Milwaukee dictating some of our procurement processes. On top of that, we have the state agency, and then you have USDA. So there's several different layers that you have to look at. What was fascinating to me is as I began to do my work where I'm consulting with other school districts, is to find out how differently other states procure compared to my state of Wisconsin. Neither are good or bad. It's just partly an interpretation of the procurement processes um, coming down from USDA, funneling through your state agency, and then down to your district and your municipality. So I think being aware of that, and if you can, talking to people in other states to find out what they're doing. And from that, you may gain a strategy that you had never thought of in your approach to procurement. For instance, one of the things that happened to me is I needed to buy a van to transport food, and it was we had 4 already, and I needed to replace it. And I don't know about you guys. Some people are into trucks and cars and all that mechanical stuff. That's not my area of expertise. So I was like, where do I even begin to put together the specifications to buy a van? Um, and so I had talked to our procurement people, and so they recommended that I call some local car dealerships, which I did, and got all kinds of information, which at the end of the day didn't mean a whole lot to me. And I was pretty overwhelmed. I'm thinking, how am I ever going to write the specifications for something as expensive and critical as a van? And what I ended up doing was talking to my computer and IT person within our district. And he said, well, is there a state contract for a van? And I didn't know anything about it. So I did some research. And lo and behold, the state of Wisconsin had a publicly awarded bid for a transport van. And within that, I could retrofit it for my racks for my food transportation system. So what that did is a couple of things. Number one, I could literally work off of that existing state bid. And so I knew what the price was going in. I didn't have to do a formal bid process. The bid was set up in such a way that any other public entity could purchase off that bid. So it saved me a ton of time. I was able to get that procurement done in just a couple months, whereas I really thought it was going to take 6 to 8 months. So that's one of the times when I would say, see if there's other resources in your wheelhouse that you could tap into. Um, and piggybacking options are a little bit different. I just talked a little bit about other institutional contracts, and I want to talk more as we go along with piggybacking because I think that's incredibly beneficial. The challenge is that in my experience, what I find is that particularly at the school district level, but also sometimes even at the state agency level, people are extremely wary of this concept of piggybacking. What is it? Is it legitimate? Is it allowed? Um, you know, well, does it meet our needs? I mean, that might have worked for another district, but does it meet our needs? And in fact, what we're seeing is across the country, more and more school districts, state agencies, and even co-ops are writing what they call a piggyback clause, which means that they plan on and they are informing whoever is going to respond to the bid that in fact there are the possibility of other districts piggybacking on it or even other public institutions. So I want you to kind of think about that as a really good option. I'm going to talk a little bit more too about cooperatives as we go through this process, but this takes some research. And I know that some people are saying, oh, I don't have time for that. I believe that you will find that any one of these options, whether it's piggybacking, whether it's looking at other school district contracts, other state held or institutional or municipality contracts that you could piggyback off of, and cooperatives, all, while you may take some initial research, will be huge huge time savers in the end. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what I want you to look at if you're thinking about changing up your procurement. And eventually it can save a tremendous amount of time. And ultimately, as we're thinking about what we're doing these days, any kind of time savings ends up giving us a good return on our investment. So stakeholder discussions are also important. If you're looking to change your procurement process, who needs to be involved in that discussion? And in part, it may be dependent on the size of your school district, because the reality is in smaller districts, you oftentimes have one person, maybe two people that you interact with for this procurement process. Maybe your business manager, could be assistant superintendent, maybe it's even the superintendent, just depending on the size of your district and the structure within the district. But it's really important that you have that conversation right out of the get-go. Let them know I'm looking at different options, and the goal is to streamline our procurement, number one. Number two, have the best tracking possibilities that we can. And number three, to give me back some of my time. That's really one of our goals. So you need to be identifying your stakeholders. With food, I think sometimes one of the key things we forget about is students. Students are stakeholders in this food procurement process, but there's other, times when there also are stakeholders, trays, silverware, even serving areas, and some of those kinds of things that we need to keep in mind to count the students in as stakeholders. I've got a couple little frameworks here. Internal stakeholders, we just talked about business officials, your procurement staff, if you're fortunate enough to have them. That's usually a position that's held within either the business office, business manager. Larger districts oftentimes have several people dedicated solely to procurement, but in smaller districts, we don't always have that luxury. So you are it. And accounting staff sometimes can give you some really interesting feedback in terms of your processes and tracking. We have to keep in mind our external stakeholders, our board members, our current vendors, because if we change things up, I can guarantee if it's different than it, and it's been someone who has been awarded a contract, they're going to ask why, what's going on, and am I still a candidate to bid? So you need to be prepared for those kinds of questions. And then keeping in mind that, if you change your process, there might be some prospective different vendors than what you've used before. And then I would again encourage you to contact your state agency. Twofold. We all know USDA procurement reviews are in process, and most states are looking at this as a learning time and an option, and trying to offer some guidance. It's always better to ask at the beginning than ask for forgiveness at the end. So I would encourage you to take that action early on in this process. So the actual procurement event, I don't necessarily want to spend a ton of time on it. I think there's a lot of information out there that comes through some of the USDA and state agency trainings about, what you need to do in terms of your procurement processes and your bid, and what kind of language needs to be there. All of the requirements that we have from USDA as far as the specific forms for procurement. At the same time, there's some other things that we kind of need to keep in mind as we're doing this. Ultimately, if we're buying something, we're spending money. And usually what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to show that this procurement is going to result in less money being spent, or there's some kind of a cost savings. So you need to monitor that. You need to track that. And I encourage people, particularly if you're doing food procurement, is to get your previous year's purchases and understand what was in there. There's a year-to-date report that most distributors can provide that will give you all kinds of detailed information in terms of volume, pricing. I also think that when I've had people do this, one of the things that happens is if you think that you've spec'd Tyson chicken patty 1, 2, 3, and you look at your distributor's report and half of your chicken patties aren't Tyson 1, 2, 3, then that's a pretty big red flag that there's something going on and you need to have a conversation with your vendor. So it's all kinds of information that is unearthed when we really try and get a year-to-date procurement report from our distributor or vendor, because we really see a lot that we may not have been aware that was happening. So I think that in that process of identifying what you're going to benchmark, you want to put together an evaluation rubric. And obviously, it's going to be important to look at the savings value. And oftentimes, as you're comparing vendors who've responded, you want to, price is going to be critically important. Even in a RFP process as compared to a bid process, price still has to be the majority of the evaluation. I think a couple key things: letting your vendors know how it's going to be evaluated beforehand is going to be really important. And then doing what you say you're going to do. If you said, okay, we're going to base 10% of evaluation on, customer service satisfaction at the high school level, okay, then do that. I think in this day and age, and part of the reason why I wanted to do it is all indicators are pointing to us, and I'm sure are way even more aware than I am how much food costs have gone up and probably will continue to go up. The supply chains have been interrupted. Even as they get started up again, they're having trouble with staffing. And sometimes supply and ingredients are an issue as well. So we know that probably food costs are going to go up. It's just, can we control for that? Can we monitor that? Likewise, when we're looking at equipment, a lot of equipment right now is backlogged or on back order, simply because they don't have the materials, or they're missing one key component. So this is all things that we need to take into consideration and be prepared for those price increases. And I think finally, just letting your internal and external stakeholders know what's happening. The bid is coming. Okay, we're going to ask students to do this. We're going to ask staff to help us evaluate on this part. Again, communication is a baseline critical first step. This is just kind of expanding on what I've just been talking about, which is data is key. Look at your historical spend. What do you think is going to happen? I think one of our biggest challenges, as I right now have been doing some work with 3 different co-ops in 3 different states, we're looking at what did we spend for this last school year. The challenge is, for many of us, we at least had part of that school year and a majority of that school year where we weren't in session. And even if we were in session, we were feeding differently. So it's really difficult to look at, like, food, for instance, and what we spent and what we purchased. So in a couple situations, we've done a comparison to understand what did we purchase in the last school year and what did we purchase in the school year before that. Again, that year-to-date report that you can often get from your distributor comes in an Excel format. It takes a little bit of finagling to kind of get that into a situation where you can compare it, but it's going to be really important for you to get an idea of what you've spent in the past. And so you can know, what do I think is going to happen this next school year? And that's where you need to calculate your estimated spend. A comparison of what would the spend be between different vendors, or getting an idea of that is going to be helpful. And that's part of that comparison of the RFP process. And keeping the evaluation subjective. It really probably, we have to keep the part of the evaluation that is subjective needs to be quantified if possible, to make it more objective. So just like I mentioned, when we're talking about customer service and we're looking at that and we're evaluating that, even if we can say a percentage of it, that at least gives us an ability to provide some feedback. At the same time, we need that objective evaluation of pricing and do they meet all of the bid requirements and all of that kind of stuff. But keep your evaluation. I really probably should have framed it a little bit better when I'm looking at this. We want the subjective, but we want that to be evaluated numerically or quantified. And then this is the last part that I think is really important, is performance management. You've got to be able to interact with your vendor. They've got to be able to be responsive to you. If you do purchase something, you've got to put together a plan for implementation. And that's one of the things that I think is really key when I'm looking at vendor responses to bids that have been put out, is what have they put in place for a plan for implementation? How are they going to communicate with you? What is their timeline for that process? And the last thing that I think we all need to be aware of is to be prepared to share those results through open records. And what I think for me, what I found is many times that evaluation rubric is incredibly valuable. So spend the time on that tool, because what it does is gives vendor feedback. It's concrete without that subjective evaluation. So that's going to be really, really important. That you be able to do that. If you look at these parts under this performance management, we look at draft and issue the RFP, establish your evaluation committee, do it by committee, and then aggregate your scores. It's going to be really important that your committee, even in a small district and you're doing an evaluation, a committee might be the food service director, the business manager, and maybe the facilities person if you're doing equipment, or a food service manager if they're doing food or some other service that's going to be used specifically in the cafeteria. That's going to be just really important. You want to quantify who the evaluators were, not necessarily by name, but by role. Food service director, business official, high school food service manager, something like that, so that the vendors who potentially could ask for feedback understand who did the evaluation. If you see that, as a vendor or supplier, if the evaluators were the first grade teacher, the third grade teacher, and a 10th grade teacher, unless there's some relevance there, that probably wouldn't be a very good evaluation. So that's why you want to think about that. And you do want to be able to look at the responses. One of the things that I really look at is the importance of being able to get the individuals of the committee to do the evaluation first, and then bring the committee together to do the actual discussion of it, and to say, okay, if this is how we've been doing it, and now we're looking for a new paradigm, is this going to work? And sometimes it's a great option, and other times you may not get a whole lot of options. So you may need to do some negotiation, or to be able to find out what the best result is going to be, or the best approach is going to be for your new contract. Just in terms of managing your contract, many of you probably already do this. Formal audit is just going into your vendors and looking at a specific time period and looking at the pricing, or going and making sure, if you're buying multiple pieces of equipment, or in the case of the co-ops that I manage, it's multiple districts, is everybody being charged the same price? Even just looking at your invoices from multiple schools can help you identify that. So a formal audit is actually when you sit down and interact with the vendor and you do a review of their invoices. It's a more in-depth process. The informal process is just what I described. It's more casual. It's things that you can do, like looking at your invoices that come in weekly. As food service director in Milwaukee Public Schools, what I did was I got a report and I reviewed it weekly. And every week I just basically, was a lot of items and whatnot, but I would look at, did all my school districts purchase? What were the outliers? If I was billed for 10,000 of something and it should have been 100, then I could identify that and be able to follow up. One of the things that I have really loved in using the Healthy Pro menu software is that there's an option in there to be able to track your pricing. And it's very, very valuable to be able to look at what you planned on for your food costs and then what your actual is. So I really needed to kind of just bring that up because it was one of the greatest tools I think would be available and accessible to a food service director, is to be able to have an opportunity to be able to track that, to look at your food costs, and be able to evaluate it. With the bid and the RFPs, part of what you want to be able to do is project your costs and see what are they going to be compared to the actual. And that's going to be really important, because one of the things you will want to be able to report out to your key stakeholders is, by going with this procurement process, we saw, in this day and age, I would say we saw, maybe a 2% increase overall in pricing, whereas if we had done our previous vendor or done a different process, we might have seen a 5%. So you need just a little snapshot, a piece of information that helps people understand why you made the choice you did at the cost that you did. We talked a little bit about piggybacking, and piggybacking is kind of a new concept. There are procurement people who say, absolutely not. There are others who understand what I talked about earlier and have said, that's definitely something that I want to be able to take advantage of. It just seems more efficient. And so we're seeing a lot of it. Yes, other school districts buying co-ops, and I'll talk about co-ops in just a minute. Other institutions, we talked about it, city purchasing, sometimes state, as I mentioned earlier, universities will sometimes let you piggyback on some of their pricing, particularly for non-food items. And state purchasing contracts, I think I shared that example with you. And then there are national and regional buying groups. So I look at it and I think about co-op is oftentimes being geographically local within one state. National and regional buying groups allow for an expansion. So you could become a member of that. And then you can even do a prime vendor bid award and use your local distributor if there's been a national contract. And you can actually join that, become a member, and subscribe to and use those services in that way. Tremendous time savings if you would look at that. So and in many situations, school districts and even states already belong to national and regional buying groups, but it's like this little kept secret only for the education side of the house. And many of us in food service don't know about it, don't know it exists. And oftentimes there's a disconnect between business managers and the education side of the house to really think about the fact that these buying groups have services that could be used by food services, or even in some cases, facilities and maintenance, or sometimes it comes in the back door through facilities and maintenance. And then the business manager realizes, oh, maybe I could do some things for school food. So please, as part of your research, check into those options. Lest you think that this is not important, I just wanted you to be able to kind of put this in perspective. When you think about the industry and the revenue in billions of dollars, we are actively involved as school people in agriculture and grocery. Those are the two biggest industries. Nationwide, across the country, over $18 billion is spent annually on food service. And so you're not chump change. And within your district, you're not chump change either. And so this is going to be important, because small steps that you take to change your procurement, get better pricing, can have a big impact. Co-ops. I love co-ops. I think that especially for small to mid-sized school districts, it's a really, really powerful tool. And I'm seeing them growing and more co-ops starting up. Um, Basically, what it allows you to do is leverage the buying power of the group of school districts that you're working with. And in essence, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you look at each single district, what they had to do, and they combine their efforts, it's going to be greater than if they each do their own procurement. Um, we learn from other members that maybe because you're in a co-op, you can call up your next door district and ask them about other things not related to purchasing. Um, I totally want to tell you that it saves you time, it saves you energy, it allows you to increase efficiency and compliance, and it can even streamline your state audits because what happens at a state-held co-op is that the co-op has to be audited for the procurement processes. You still have some things you have to do, but by and large, a great deal of the responsibility and certainly the time that we talked about being spent in procurement is shifted off of your plate as the individual school and onto the district. Um, and I cannot stress enough, and it comes home to me again and again because the co-ops that I work with have a food budget almost identical to that of what I worked with in Milwaukee Public Schools. And what I see is that when you have the buying power that one district that's a large district has, you really can get better pricing. And you know, it may be 1 to 3 cents a serving, but boy, we all know how much that adds up. We're a game of pennies. So I think understanding that being able to leverage your buying power is probably the most powerful thing that can be done to when you join a co-op. Wow, I've run through that pretty quickly. I'm not sure if there would be questions or not. And if some people, you know, have thoughts, I'm more than open to feedback, ideas.
Thanks, Kymm. Yeah,
Sure.
you can put your questions for Kymm in the chat and we can field those.